Welcome to The Forgotten, Season 2, Episode 2, A Rising Star. It had been a long way from County Wexford, Ireland, to Massachusetts for Patrick Kennedy, and it had been an almost as hard way for his widow and his son to surmount the tragedy of his rather early death. A crisis which they handled admirably, at least from a financial standpoint. Now, Patrick Kennedy's grandson Joseph Patrick, Joe, was about to join one of the best and most exclusive colleges in the country, after graduating from one of the best and most exclusive schools in the country. You could say that the American dream became reality for the Kennedys. PJ had quite a substantial income from both politics and his liquor importing businesses. Given that his father had been nothing else than a cooper who had fled the Emerald Isle as a result of the Great Famine, he made it. The only surviving son, Joe, however, rather spent his time on his extracurricular activities than on studying, although he, unlike Gneisenau, if you remember, did not waste his time with alcohol. He regarded those activities higher than his scholarly studies. Nonetheless, he graduated from a school which was considered to be one of the, if not the most difficult school in the US in 1908. Harvard, where he enrolled in fall that year, however, was something different. The incredibly hard and expansive curriculum at Boston Latin had prepared Joe and his classmates perfectly. Furthermore, at Harvard, there were no mandatory courses, so Joe did not have to take mathematics, physics and Latin, which he did despise, but instead take 4 years of economics, government, and several years of German, French and history, as well as other courses, especially literature. So, from a perspective of difficulty, Harvard was a piece of cake compared to what he had to go through at Boston Latin. But another, way more complicated field that Joe had to master was the social structure at Harvard, which was, from what I've read about it, way more complicated and obdurate than any European court could have possibly been. As an Irish Catholic Democrat, one of rather few, Joe was not an outcast, but someone under the radar of the high-nosed Protestant Republican quasi-aristocrats. Harvard at that time could be divided into 3 different Harvards. The first one being the family Harvard, rather an exclusive club for enormously rich and powerful than a real university. The intellectual Harvard, however, was much like the first one, but rather considered as the scientific and humanistic part of the university, where only the best and brightest resided. The third branch, the public school Harvard, stood at the very bottom of the ladder. The facilities used by those courses were rather modest, as well as their dining rooms and their clubs. Many a young man from those lower classes, which, as you have to remember, was still rather wealthy by today's measurement, joined a fraternity. Although there were, of course, rather exclusive ones for the richest of the rich, many fraternities had no special improved clubs and dining rooms, and were just a honor-related thing. Sounds good, right? Well, if you are willing to suffer a week or two of quasi-military drill, and the common abuses any common soldier gets to know during his basic training multiplied by 10, sure. Joe Kennedy joined the Delta Kappa Epsilon, DKE or Dickie if you will, and had those initiation rites. After returning from this initiation week, a process he never really talked about after, one of his Harvard dorm mates noted in his diary, "After observing his back, I was not impressed with fraternities anymore." As Joe was quite socially active and, because of his dashing character and his outstandingly good looks, quite popular, he was tasked with planning several proms and other committees, so it was no hard task for him to use his contacts to join the most prominent final club, the Delta Upsilon, where he would, as the name suggests, stay up until his graduation. So things were going great for 20-year-old Joe, especially love-wise. Rose Fitzgerald, his romantic target, completely fell for him. Given the rather little distance from Boston to Cambridge, they saw each other at any given opportunity. Whenever he went home for a weekend, Whenever he and his friends made a weekend trip, and especially at the great amount of balls and festivities which were held at Harvard, Jo and Rose became inseparable. As a little anecdote I found in Nasaw's The Patriarch, her dancing cards, the dancing cards young women had to fill out to record with which gentleman they danced at the ball they attended, and which the respective gentlemen then had to sign so the parents could control them, were usually filled with lots and lots of Jo's aliases, so that the still not too happy Honey Fitz, her father, could not notice that she was given way too much attention to by the wrong gentleman. However, his girlfriend's father was no one Jo wanted to be friends with. When Honey Fitz, after 2 scandalous years as a mayor, was not re-elected, PJ still wanted to be in the city government and wanted to be elected for a simple post in the now Republican municipal government. However, Honey Fitz, enraged by PJ not supporting him during his campaign, sabotaged the election and put PJ's political career to a grinding halt. Several of Jo's biographers, especially Whalen and of course Nasaw, make this moment responsible for Jo's rather ambivalent stance on his own party. He had been raised as a Democrat, and he was a member of the party for pretty much all his lifetime, serving under a Democrat president and pretty much helping another, his son John, in the saddle. Jo never was a loyal and disciplined party politician. Instead, he always regarded his own political opinion and his own instincts to be the best, and did not fear to go against the opinion of the majority or high-ups in his party. He was, after all, a rather uncomfortable subordinate. Honey Fitz, however, after a campaign that, in its viciousness and unprofessionality from both sides, easily rivaled the 2016 presidential election, was re-elected as mayor in 1910. Another rather interesting story is Jo's last summer before graduation. Intending to improve his finances, which were already pretty good regarding his allowance, he and one of his Harvard friends bought an old bus, called it the Mayflower, and opened his own little tourist sightseeing bus, pretty much the first one in Boston, where he bombarded his passengers with historical facts he learned at university and by researching in the Boston Library. I find this to be a rather interesting business model in those times. So, to quote Nasaw again, in June 1912 he had his Harvard degree, several lifelong friends, and a number of proper Bostonian contacts he could call on in the future. The young gentleman surprised both his family, his girlfriend, and his friends with his choice of career. Joseph P. Kennedy, who had disliked math and was more of a sports and politics person, decided to go into the financial sector and went to banking and finance, which, for a Catholic Irishman in those times, where all assets and banks which were important were in control of the proper Bostonian Protestant families, was a rather treacherous and outright dangerous path. But it was also a rather promising career. Or, as Jo himself said, a career ladder with more than one rung. Banking was important in all businesses, and especially in Boston, a lot of capital was to be deposited and invested. So, he spent the first half year after his graduation in the Columbia Trust Company, a bank which his father had pretty much co-founded and funded. After this half year was over, he became a state bank examiner, a job that paid rather little, about $35,000 in today's purchasing power, but granted him invaluable insights into the financial world. He still lived rather cheaply at his parents' house, who had moved to Winthrop, where his father found some kind of quiet, comfortable exile after the abrupt end of his political career, and he spent his free hours with investing his earnings, especially what he had put aside from his tour bus adventure, into anything he deemed profitable. Most of this he invested into a single real estate company which was run by a friend of his. He just supplied the money, let the others do the work, making a decent profit. This profit, however, Jo did not invest cautiously. Instead, he went on vacation. In 1913, he spent a fortune on a first-class trip to Europe aboard the Kaiserin Auguste Victoria, named after the wife of William II of Germany, and belonging to the Hamburg-Amerika-Linie. They had enough money to travel first class, but Jo managed to get them imperial suites for an uptrade of $100 for all of them, which would usually have been the price per person. This, of course, had made a great impression on all the girls aboard, and made Joe the ladies' man of the cruise, of course without the knowledge of his beloved at home in Boston. Later that year, in December, he went on to leave his job as an assistant bank examiner and return to the Columbia Trust Company, where he had got his first insights to the business. His future father-in-law, Honey Fitz, was running for re-election this year. Joe Kennedy, although he had no reason to like this man other than that he loved his daughter, founded, together with others and his friends, the Young Men's Non-Partisan League, which was absolutely partisan, as it endorsed Honey Fitz and supported his campaign. Fitzgerald's opponent, however, the clear-cut epitome of a Protestant Irish-hating aristocrat, threatened to expose one of his many affairs with a girl that was about Rose's age. Afraid of being depicted as a borderline pedophile, yes, back in the days that would have been the term, Casanova, he saw no other chance than to completely retire from politics and withdraw to his opulent mansion to finally spend time with his family. Following this quasi-disgrace, he became way less picky in his choice of a son-in-law, which would of course only benefit young Joseph. What did not benefit him, however, was that the League would now have to turn over their campaigning strategy to a completely other candidate only 1 month before the election. Of course, this led to disaster. On 14th of January, the Irish-hating bigot Michael Curley was elected mayor. Nonetheless, his financial career went brilliantly. With the support of his father and many other Bostonian Irishmen, he became, at age 25, the youngest bank president in Massachusetts, the president of the Columbia Trust Company. Soon-to-be father-in-law Honey Fitz added on that, still being mayor of Boston until the inauguration in early February, making him chairman of the Collateral Loan Company, which specialized in giving loans to the poor, an unpaid but prestigious position. Apparently, Joe had won the old man over. He quickly rose to be the shining new star of Boston's financial businesses. His bank, the only bank in Boston which actually lost assets instead of making profit, quickly got a second wind once he was president. Using all his contacts and sometimes a little dubious business practices, which he himself would make illegal later as a chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, he managed to increase the company's assets by 27% in only 6 months. This baffled the old Bostonian bankers, and they became more than uneasy about this young gentleman who had blown up his bank's business in a short amount of time. Even more important, Joe finally had the sufficient background, socially and financially, to ask Rose Kennedy to marry him. She said yes on the 20th of June 1914, and if you check this date on the calendar of historically important dates, you will see that only 1 week later, Franz Ferdinand was murdered in the town of Sarajevo. The financial result of the declarations of war that followed was panic. Such panic that not even a little bank like Columbia Trust, with such a competent president as Joe, did not survive it unharmed. European banking houses in America did sell all their stocks and cash in all their bonds in exchange for gold, which, to prevent a total crash of the market, led to Wall Street being closed on July 31st until November. Transatlantic trade came to a standstill, which hit Boston incredibly hard, as the town was by then the major port for goods exchange and wharves on the coast. Columbia Trust suffered some considerable setbacks, but since it was rather small, it survived better than the bigger ones. Furthermore, Joe and Rose finally married on 7th October, his oldest friend and partner on the tour bus, Joe Donovan, being his best man. After a short honeymoon around NYC and Boston, Joe got back to work, which would coin their relationship for the next years. Lending himself money from his own bank, as I said, shoddy business practices, he bought a nice little house on Beale Street in Boston, where Rose and him moved in together. He left the interior and furnishing to his new wife while getting his finances in order again. The honeymoon and the move had left him with liquid personal assets of no more than $500, which were at least over $10,000 in today's buying power, and he had a mortgage from his own bank to pay back, figured somewhere at $4,000. So he spent day and night working. However, almost destroying his reputation as a banker, the Collateral Loan Company had been robbed by its president of a majority of its assets by turning its pawn's money into rather dubious mining certificates, a process which was rather hard to detect for Joe and his fellow directors, but still, they were the ones who were to blame most easily. He cooperated with the officials who worked on this case fully, but was, although he did not do anything wrong, not reappointed after his term was over, as it was common. This left a big stain on the star of the young banker for the next years. By fall that year, the financial situation in America started to improve again, as overseas trade was, under the serious protection of the Royal Navy, open again. Next week, we shall see about Joseph P. Kennedy's star rising further, and, last but not least, his contribution to the US war effort. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, which was most certainly not filled with the most exciting events, but leaves an interesting view on the young, dynamic, and ambitious banker and his surroundings. As another point next week, we are going to dive in deeper on the relationship between him and his wife, and see the birth of his first children, John Fitzgerald, aka Jack Kennedy, among them. I'd like to ask you to give the podcast an honest review if you are listening on iTunes, or comment your feelings and ideas below if you are listening somewhere else. I am very much looking forward to debating, discussing, and answering questions. I wish you a good day, or good night. See you next time.